We're recording this on the day that the Democrats, Kamala Harris, has made her vice presidential candidate pick. So, in the spirit of your book, which includes a lot of people putting a percentage or odds on something that theoretically one cannot, there's a big discussion right now, a big discussion about whether or not Josh Shapiro, governor of the state of Pennsylvania, tipping point state, most important state in the election, smart, popular, crossover appeal in theory. The big debate right now is whether or not his being Jewish was a deciding factor in Kamala Harris shifting to governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz. So, in the spirit of your book, where you put a percentage on these controversial, thorny, fraught, what is the percentage that you would put on Josh Shapiro's Jewishness as the deciding factor in his being passed over, as it were, and having predicted swing against him to Walz? And I will add one little thing before I give you your time to answer that. I am bundling the pro-Israel position of Shapiro into the overall Jewishness. Yes, I'm specifying just to make things simpler, number one, and number two, because I believe that his views on Israel are a fairly normative Jewish guy position. So let's start with that, and then we'll get into the book.
Yeah, I was going to ask kind of to use a definition in a sentence and kind of National Spelling Bee style. The bundle of Jewishness plus his views on the conflict in Gaza plus the left being upset about his position on the conflict in Gaza and why that is exactly, I think that's probably about half of it. The Jewish part alone, I think, might be a little bit less than half of it, but why he has these kind of, on the one hand, normie Democratic positions, two-state solution, Netanyahu bad, Hamas bad, is basically the kind of trilogy of standard center-left Democrat positions on Israel. He did volunteer as a younger person in the IDF, not in a combat role, but so there are a couple of things like that. But no, this kind of metastasized into a story where clearly the left was going to pick a fight if he was chosen. And if you're conflict averse, as Democrats usually tend to be, although not with Biden, when they replaced Biden, if you were conflict averse and you want to make a consensus-based decision, then sometimes silly things become real things, right? I mean, in the book, I call this community the village. The village is basically politics, media, maybe except for Substack, government, etc. And it's a consensus-driven place where you are afraid of offending people, where you're not necessarily taking the higher upside play if it risks blowing up in your face or if it risks unpleasant social consequences. And I think this was a risk-averse decision. Not outside the boundaries of the margin of error. I mean, I think Tim Walz is a pretty good candidate. And the downsides are maybe overrated, but there are actual downsides. I mean, she has a lot of momentum. I think momentum in politics, like in sports, is usually overrated, but maybe this is kind of an exception where she was just chosen as a candidate a week and a half ago. Is that right? I mean, it's been not been very long.
Yeah.
So I kind of understand it, but it contrasts with this bolder decision that Democrats made to shove Joe Biden in front of a bus because he was going to lose. And then the kind of very quick, bold consolidation around Harris. And it makes me think a bit, it's a more conventional Democratic way of doing things, which is kind of risk averse and consensus driven, as opposed to gambling on this candidate who obviously has very high upside, but might present a headache or two.
I'm going to put it at 53.5%. His Jewishness as the deciding factor. It's complicated with VP picks, though, because there are misaligned incentives where candidates don't want to be shown up by a talented VP because people might murmur about how, and then you've got on the other side where you've got weird incentives. We don't even discuss how Brian Kemp would be a very wise VP pick for Donald Trump. Instead, we discuss how he's slamming Kemp at a rally because of his own personal grievances. So the personality of the candidate can get in the way of doing what is best for maximizing odds of victory.
Yeah, look, I think that's a non-trivial factor, the kind of upstage thing. I mean, the analogy I used on my podcast with Maria Konnikova is that, like, what's it like if you had Joe Biden win the Democratic nomination in 2008 and then Barack Obama becomes his VP pick? Now, look, I think Harris is a more dynamic politician than Biden, although Biden wasn't bad back in the day. And although Shapiro has some Obamian affect, he's not Obama yet. But there's a little bit of an issue of being upstage, but you want to create excitement and they've battled the election to 50-50 roughly in our model, but 50-50 is still 50-50. I know there's some football analogy of a situation where the math says to go for two in a situation that most people don't.
I've got the football analogy here because this might not be analytical per se. This is more of a vibes, Bill Simmons-y take on it. The reaction of people who want Trump to win today looks a little bit like when your fan base is watching a football game and the opposing coach doesn't go for it on 4th and inches and you're just relieved. That's what it looks like. So that's not scientific, but you could say that it was a poor choice just based on how thrilled and relieved they appear to be.
Yeah, one of the Trump polling strategist leads was like, giddily tweeting yesterday, it's going to be Tim Walz. I've heard it's going to be Tim Walz, exclamation point, exclamation point. It's like, maybe you shouldn't be going with Tim Walz then. If the other party understands its strategic consent. I mean, you feel that, right? If you're a football fan or you're playing poker or anything like that, then you really benefit when your opponent makes a bad decision, right? Even if it's an uncertain probabilistic decision, then you're like, oh, that was really nice of this opponent to like fold this hand that could have caught a flush against me or whatever else when she had the odds to continue or something. And yeah, I look, the other thing too is that like we have to get more reporting on to what degree there was backsliding here or cold feet, because it certainly looked like they have a rally plan tonight when we're recording this in Pennsylvania, which seemed like it naturally might be to have the governor of Pennsylvania come on stage. And I'm sure he'll be there. I'm sure he'll
be a good soldier.
He'll be a good soldier and then probably hate her guts for the rest of his life. And then try to seek the nomination himself in 4 years or 8 years or whatever. But, them getting cold feet makes it more seem like maybe it was the Israel Jewish left bundle of stuff, right? But also like just as a tactician, and I'm not a tactician, more of a strategy guy, it seems like something wasn't handled well in how these issues were vetted, right? Because there were some pretty minor scandals of like, covering up a sexual harassment scandal and whatever, et cetera, that didn't seem to have a lot of there, but began to metastasize a little bit. And so like, I wonder if the Shapiro press people weren't very good and he should have been calling in more favors and had people agitating for him like Tim Walz had with like Nancy Pelosi and Bernie Sanders. And I don't think he played his hand very well, which by the way is, reveals a little bit of information maybe about what kind of a surrogate that he'd be potentially. Maybe there's some, totally speculating, maybe there's some ego there, and that ego combined with kind of Harris's feeling of like, yeah, I don't know if you want to have 2 stars on the ticket. Usually that's not how it works, but it's all pretty weird. The lack of consideration for Gretchen Whitmer, for example. I guess you don't want 2 women, but I'm not sure where that conventional wisdom even comes from. Like, who's the guy who's like, oh, I just need 1 man on the ticket, just one. That's good enough for me. It's a little bit weird.